Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today I would like to continue on with the October 2020 film TV series discussion. Now, as we all know, 'tis the season. We are very close to Halloween, and so it has been my great pleasure to be able to upload a video a day with respect to a particular film, or in some cases a TV show that is in keeping with the Halloween spirit or tradition. So today is, in my view anyway, no exception to that. And so today I'd like to talk to you, if I may, about a particular film. It's, relatively speaking, quite a recent film, because it's a 2018 film. This is a remarkable, fascinating achievement that I think is, in many aspects, more than meets the eye, at least as far as I see it anyway. It is also classified, I think quite rightly so, as a horror film and an example, a really wonderful, prime example of the genre, in my humble opinion. As I mentioned, this is a 2018 film. This is directed by Luca Guadagnino, and the name of the film is Suspiria. This is the film Suspiria, the recent film. I should say, as I indicated earlier, that this is, I think, directly speaking, oftentimes described as being a horror film or an example from the horror genre. And I think those descriptions are not in any way inaccurate, because we are dealing, of course, with a story that involves a dance academy set in 1970s Berlin, and we have dance students, in particular one student who is played by Dakota Johnson, and we have the dance instructors, in particular one that is played by Tilda Swinton. And so we have the interaction between the students and the instructors. Also, we have the school itself, and we have certain sinister goings-on that lead to further events and revelations and resolutions, and the discovery of certain mysteries surrounding this particular dance academy, and which leads to a very memorable conclusion of the events. So in that sense, I think it is a film which has many horror elements to it. There are certainly a number of scenes, and I won't go into too much detail here, but suffice to say, there are a number of scenes that deal with the horrific and oftentimes the ghastly or grotesque. So that makes this film certainly not for everyone. For anyone who is not easy with this kind of genre, or for whom this type of film is not one's cup of tea, this is, of course, by no means any kind of command to have to watch this film. Of course, you don't have to watch this film. So this is obviously not for you, and that's perfectly fine. However, for those for whom this type of genre is okay, then we have this Luca Guadagnino directed film, Suspiria. I think we should mention what is perhaps one of the most obvious points of this film, which is that we have the existence of the 1970s film directed by Dario Argento, written by Dario Argento and Daria Nicolodi, which is called Suspiria. The Argento film Suspiria is, in my view, an unparalleled masterpiece. It is not just a masterpiece of the horror genre, but it is also a masterpiece of cinema. And it is one of my favorite films. It's certainly one of my favorite films directed by Dario Argento. So this is to say, in a nutshell, that I am totally in love with and enthralled by the Dario Argento work, Suspiria. So in that sense, we have this film, the new film, 2018 Suspiria, which for all intents and purposes could be described by many, quite reasonably so, to be a remake of the Dario Argento film. And indeed we see certain connections, certain parallels, character names, narrative threads, thematic treatments, and the like. We see workings or reworkings of similar types of points brought up in the Dario Argento film, now explored in a same, similar, or perhaps a variant in the new film of Suspiria, the Luca Guadagnino film. And so in that sense, we do have this remake relationship between the Argento work and the Guadagnino work. The title is the same, the essence of the plot is the same. However, of course, as we also know, the films are very different, I think. So much so that we can watch one film and not necessarily be spoiled upon watching the other. This is to say that they each have their own unique characteristics and identity. Each stands on its own legs to be its own unique cinematic entity. And I find this relationship, therefore, to be a very fascinating one. It could, therefore, be such that for some people, watching the new film, Suspiria, might mean automatically having to compare the new Suspiria with the Dario Argento Suspiria work. And in that comparative analysis, maybe one might find the Guadagnino work to be somewhat lacking, or maybe not to the same levels as the Argento work. And I know a number of people who've expressed this to me directly, and I have nothing wrong with that kind of approach, because I can completely understand this viewpoint. As I say before, I am a real fan and I'm truly grateful admirer of the Argento work. So I love that film so much. So I understand it if people look at the new film and think it doesn't hold up to the earlier Argento work. However, I also believe that this film, the Guadagnino work Suspiria, is one of the most fascinating recent films that I have seen in a while, for a number of reasons. And I think for those reasons, I find this film to be utterly satisfying and quite spectacular, and one of my favorite recent films of late. Now, those reasons are, as I say, it is a horror film, and so there are some elements that are quite shocking and horrific, making me feel very queasy. And so that is, I think, indicative of the cinematic effect and power of the filmmaking aspect here. I don't deny the power, because I think it's right there, and it's played out quite extraordinarily. Another reason why I really admire this work is I do like the way it treats the Dario Argento film material, and yet it sometimes takes details and turns them on their heads. It maybe makes variants that I think lead to interesting different avenues. It makes the plot different from the earlier work, and so that means that there is enough room left for a number of plot development surprises along the way. And so I enjoy that. I enjoy the enrichment of that kind of viewing experience. I find it to be very rewarding and fascinating. And so I don't mind the relationship, the sort of remake relationship. And in fact, I think for me anyway, this remake relationship is one of the fascinating aspects, and so it makes me want to watch it again, and to see what other surprises the film has in store. And I should point out, before I move on, is that I don't think, I know for a fact, 100% sure, that that kind of exercise in watching this film does in no way, for me, diminish the power of the Dario Argento work. And so I still hold the Dario Argento work in such high regard, but still I find this film so fascinating and extraordinary. So I do think, therefore, in my head and in my heart, the two films can coexist in peace and harmony. Although they do have a very interesting and oftentimes very playful and, dare I say it, even a quite artistically daring and maybe even occasionally antagonistic relationship, which I think benefits the films quite nicely. So that's another reason. And yet another reason why I really find this film fascinating and admire it so much is that it takes bold chances and risks. And I think in particular there are certain characterizations of specific characters that are quite daring. And the choices made with those story arcs, I think, are quite bold. So I admire that approach very much. Thematically speaking, too, I like this because it has in the setting of Berlin, 1970s Berlin, I think on the one hand it does try to link with certain specific aspects of the earlier film in terms of the setting in Germany, etc. And the 70s time period, I think, is directly or indirectly linked to the time period in which the earlier film had been released in the 1970s, and other similar parallels like that. However, what I really admire about this work in context of the time period and setting is that it really puts into context the political and social climate, and in some aspects upheaval, that was prevalent in Germany in the 1970s. And we're talking about Berlin in the 1970s. So this is Cold War. So we have to remember this is a divided Germany into East and West. And so this idea of division, which is a geopolitically based one, as I say, it is before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so this is a Cold War climate. This is, I think, an incredibly important aspect, one of the key aspects of the film, which is that if we understand the film in terms of its direct narrative to be a film that is, I think, among other things, about identity. It is about either loss of identity or claim or reclaiming of identity. It is also a film that is very heavily steeped in the idea of division, in terms of, let's say, dance academy, internal politics and allegiances. Let me just put it that way. So there are certain divisions on that regard. There are cultural differences which might lead to certain divisions in terms of, say, from things like the makeup of the dance academy all the way to, say, divisions between the outside and the inside. And the characters that are represented on the outside of the academy versus the inside of the academy. Plus, as I was indicating earlier, even further divisions within the academy itself. And that is, I think, a directly narrative and character-based thematic discussion and exploration of this idea of division. But what is so fascinating, too, is that this idea of division is something that is expressed, I think, on a not just on a micro level, but on a macro level and on a broad socio-political and geopolitical level. And we see the extension of this in terms of the division internally and also externally. Internally by way of those character divisions that I tried to indicate here, and also the external focus by making the film take place in the Cold War era. And we actually have a divided city, a divided country, a divided a geopolitical landscape, which is very vivid. And to take that metaphor, or not metaphor, but to take that thematic exploration to metaphoric level, shall we say, I think this is utterly fascinating in that I think we see here, and I'll try to be as vague as possible, but I think therefore we see here a very deep, profound exploration of the notion of character division and emotional division, and the way in which that division leads to certain emotional states of mind, whether that can be called emotional trauma, whether that can be called an attempt, a yearning at some kind of cross-divisional reconciliation. And I'm talking in pure psychological, emotional terms, the micro, internal, human heart level. The idea of division, therefore, is very important. It is fascinating, therefore, that I see this film as being making extensions outward into the realm of the macro, such that the emotional psychological divisions are, I think, on a metaphorical level and thus on a broad cinematic level, linked so poetically with the divisions that we see in the geopolitical sphere, such that it makes a perfect metaphor statement that the political or the external is somehow automatically or inextricably linked with the internal strife and the emotional division. In other words, the external divisions and the internal divisions are ever so linked. And I find that to be a very profound statement, because what it says essentially is that the political is ultimately the human. And whatever happens in the political sphere or the geopolitical sphere, however it's expressed, either on the nationalistic level in terms of the political and social unrest that we see depicted in pockets here and there in the film, or if we take even a further step back on an even broader international level in terms of the Cold War divisions. Whatever the case may be, there is still this idea of a geopolitical-based division, or a national a division based on economic or political or social grounds on a national level. But then we can go even further, which is therefore that these sorts of divisions or political expressions are ultimately human, because we see therefore the links caused by these divisions both externally and internally. And I find that metaphorical link, if you will, to be very, very profound. That is to say also that I think there is a certain way to watch this film, and I think it's one way to look at it is also to see the psychological implications that, say, divisions on a macro level have on the human soul and the human spirit and the human psyche, which is, I think, another way to say that everything is related. And I find, therefore, the boldness of this film to take this avenue is striking and, I think, refreshing in terms of the approach that it takes. And it also, therefore, means that it is a film that yields itself very nicely to rewatch and rewatch and rewatch, because once we have this idea planted in our heads, then we can look at it and we can see all these metaphors that are brought up: the idea of division, the idea of angst, trauma, yearning, reconciliation, the need to rejoin, to find the other, and all that kind of existential dread and psychological trauma and turmoil, as well as emotional satisfaction, at least on a potential level anyway, can result in. And I think, therefore, this film holds a lot of wonderful potential rewards upon watch and rewatch and even further rewatch. So this is to say that ultimately that this film, Suspiria, the 2018 film, is, in my view, a horror film that is very effective. It is also a horror film that is linked to the past in terms of its remake relationship status with the Dario Argento work. And it is also, I think, among other things, too, trying very hard, and I think very successfully, to wrestle, to grapple with the notions of the geopolitical and how they affect everyone on a minute level, either directly or in cinematic terms, or in terms of a cinematically produced or presented metaphor. And before I leave, I should point out, too, that the music, the Thom Yorke music, is one of my absolute favorite recent soundtracks. I still quite regularly listen to this soundtrack. I think the songs are immaculate. They are thematically perfect. They are beautiful. They are just gut-wrenching on a lot of levels. They are incredibly filled with emotion and impact. And they are tender, and they are warm, and they are also mysterious and fragmented and elusive, and so much more. And the rough coolness and the beautiful grace of the singing voice, I think, adds to the overall effect it has on me, which is one of feeling quite overwhelmed every time I listen to it. So that's a word on the soundtrack for the 2018 version. Once again, I should just emphasize that my love and admiration for this new version, I think, can coexist quite nicely with my love and admiration for the Dario Argento version. And I resist the question, or trying to answer the question, which is better? Is this better or that better? I resist trying to answer that question because I don't think, for me, that's not. I think I don't think, for me, trying to figure out the answer to that question is the point, but rather, how can we see this film when we see many other films, or we see the scope of history play itself out? And so I always like to think of this film in context, just like I always like to think of the Argento film in a kind of context. And I think in the way that I was trying to describe in non-spoilish terms, I think this film, for me anyway, when viewed within a certain context or contexts, I think makes for some really compelling watch indeed. So this is the 2018 film Suspiria, directed by Luca Guadagnino. What an unforgettable work this is. I've seen it many times already, and it just gets better and better for me every single time. Suspiria. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. So until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you once again for your time, as always, my dear friends, and cheers.